So I'll go ahead and get started and I'll introduce you to our Viewpoint speakers. This is another intergenerational pair. I'm pleased to introduce you to Jon Thaxton and Lee Amos. Jon Thaxton creates and implements Gulf Coast Community Foundation's key strategies for transforming our region's nonprofit community and providing leadership on emerging issues. Jon joined Gulf Coast in 2012 as Director of Community Investment while completing his 12th year of service on the Sarasota County Commission, and he was promoted to Senior Vice President in 2015. In this role, Jon works with nonprofit organizations, donors, and other community partners to invest Gulf Coast resources in projects that will transform our region and improve public policies. Jon is also recognized throughout Florida as a leading advocate for protecting the natural environment. A fifth-generation Floridian, he was raised on a farm near Osprey and began working at his family's real estate company at the age of 14. Jon began his environmental advocacy at Venice High School in 1974 as the founding member of his ecology club. Lee Amos is land steward and staff biologist at Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast. He specializes in plant propagation and conservation and has worked with the Florida Native Plant Society, Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, and Sweet Bay Nursery to encourage the widespread use and enjoyment of Florida's fabulous flora. At Conservation Foundation, Lee is responsible for parks and preserve stewardship, map-making and geographic analysis, and assisting with the acquisition of new preserves. Currently, he is restoring and planning public recreation on 230 acres on Pine Island, as well as monitoring and maintaining 10 conservation properties from Manatee County all the way to Lee County. Lee earned his bachelor's in biology from Tennessee Wesleyan College and is an avid outdoorsman. Lee enjoys camping, kayaking, hiking, and sharing his knowledge of our extraordinary environment. Please help me in welcoming to the stage Jon Thaxton and Lee Amos.
So as you were told, the rest of the afternoon is going to be dedicated to science and advocacy in the public square. It's a pretty difficult topic to cover, and I know there's a lot in the audience here that have experience navigating this difficult space. Lee and I were asked to discuss it from a kind of a multi-generational perspective based on our individual experiences. I think I'll let you be the young person, Lee. And
just this time.
Yeah, just this time, and I'll assume the senior role. So, Lee, I think the first question is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Jon. So you've been doing this for a little while, and I'm curious how you got started in land preservation, and if there were any early influences that motivated you to pursue this now lifelong passion.
So when I was in I went to Osprey Elementary School. I grew up on a small family farm in central Sarasota County in the town of Osprey. It was an old fishing village. I had a 7,000 head chicken ranch that I grew up on, which is adjacent to Palmer Ranch. So I had the really, really fortunate opportunity to fish in all of the Sarasota bays from the late 60s and to hunt in the hinterlands of what is now the Palmer Ranch community. So it was a very fortunate place for me to be in. I published my first letter to the editor when I was in 5th grade. I went back and read it. It's on the environment. And then when I got in high school, I was a pretty decent student up until about 9th grade, and then things started to go really wrong really fast. So I built a very impressive arrest record, actually, before I got, and this is all true, this is not made up, before I got out of high school. And in my junior year, I had this most remarkable high school biology teacher. His name was Bill Wimbish. And Bill Wimbish convinced me to write a letter to the Florida Department of Transportation and convince them not to run I-75 through the delicate wetlands in eastern Sarasota County, because the interstate wasn't here at the time. The letter was a miserable failure, but I was hooked. I finally found a way to take these negative energies and turn them into something positive, and I haven't stopped until this day. So I was influenced by Mr. Wimbish, who was a generation before me, and I guess my question to you, Lee, would be, has my generation taught yours anything, that's useful?
Actually, I would say it skipped a generation. So going backwards. So my grandmother is a very difficult woman, but has been very influential in my life. She's somebody that was born before the Great Depression, grew up in the Great Depression. She came of age. She was a young adult in Washington, D.C., and signed up to work for the government. She hand drew maps of the Pacific Islands during World War II. After that, she ran off to California, totally a crazy thing. She met a sailor. My grandfather, they got married, and they went around the world. They came back, and my grandfather actually became a very heavy drinker and left her. And she was in Arcadia with 2 kids by herself and had to raise them by herself. She had a tough go of things. And then when she was 75, she thought, this is the perfect age for me to do something I don't know how to do. She bought a farm in East Tennessee and moved up there. And so growing up, I spent 13 years living on the farm and doing all this stuff, and it was very formative to me. What my grandmother gave me with this farm is really an identity. She taught me a land ethic that it comes from living on the land, and she taught me to work hard and to be self-reliant, and when faced with a problem, she gave me a confidence that I could figure it out and do it. That all comes from my grandmother.
I can share similar stories with my grandparents and great-grandparents who also grew up here in Sarasota at a time when 5 Points was a watering trough for horses, and there was little fences at that time, and sometimes the cattle would venture in from the eastern lands and get into the watering trough there. Actually, I had one of my uncles caught some alligators, baby alligators, out in Mayaca and brought them into the 5 Points watering station and put them in there just to see who could put their hand in there first to try to get them out. So if you could persuade your generation to do just one thing different, or if you have more than one, what would that be?
Little story. So living on the farm one year, we had harvested all of our hay. We had it baled up in our hay fields, but we didn't have the means to put it away. Okay, and we found out there was rain in the forecast, and we were very despondent over this. We didn't know what we were going to do. And our neighbor happened to swing by, and casual conversation, he found out we were in this situation. And he's like, oh, that's no problem. Well, he just went up the road. He brought down his tractor and his trailer. And this is like at 7 o'clock at night. We worked from then till like 2 a.m. thereabouts, putting hay away. And it rained the next day, and we were fine. And it was all due to this neighbor. And it was sort of a revelation to me, because my grandmother, she's somebody that never had anyone in her life to help her. And so she's always focused on working really hard and going it alone. And I sort of saw this other way where you could have friends, neighbors, community to help you. So if I could encourage my siblings and millennials to do something differently, it would be to turn outwards, because I see my brother and sister doing a lot of internet stuff. Social media, oddly enough, sometimes is more isolating than it is connecting. I would encourage them to turn outwards and to invest in organizations like the not-for-profits here, religious organizations, political organizations, and get connected. Because we have a lot of problems, and they're too difficult to do by yourself. You have to go out there and get connected and know people, and I really think we need to do it now.
Yeah, we've heard a few times mentioned in the from panel discussions and others, this last generation concept, and I guess I either get credit or blame for coming up with this idea. And it happened, I can remember John O'Miller and I. John O'Miller's he's like a brother to me, and he's one of the most remarkable and creative persons that I've ever had the honor to work with. And so we were thinking about the very first environmentally sensitive lands campaign, at least in the recent time, and who's going to do it, and we ultimately both came to the conclusion, well, if we don't do it, it's probably not going to not going to get done. And what motivated me is, as a real estate broker, I used to always take the ready maps and put them out on the floor of the real estate office. And I would watch every other year as the ready maps came in. I could see, these lands that would be lost. And so I looked at the development proposals that were pending with the Sarasota Commission at the time, and it was very clear to see that, there's been people here, as we've learned, there's been people in this community for 12,000 years. And for 12,000 years, every generation has had a conscious choice of whether they're going to preserve large-scale, intact, natural landscapes. Those decisions will be over in very short order. Clearly, if I live to be 80 or 90, those decisions will be made in my lifetime. So I started talking with Christine Johnson and others and saying, look, this is it. We are the last generations of Sarasotans to actually have an option as to whether we preserve these intact large native landscapes or not. We could come back later and we could restore some of the landscapes, some of the pasture lands that were altered through human activity. But the really good stuff, the stuff that was either created by natural forces or by the creator, him or herself, whichever belief system you gravitate towards, we're it. There's not going to be another shot at this. And so for me, it just put a sense of immediacy into getting this done and getting it done now.
Absolutely. And, John, one of the things that we really need to focus on in the next couple years is locking in these large parcels out east in land preservation. Before I started working at the Conservation Foundation, I had a binary view of land preservation. Okay, so there was not preserved lands, places like my house and the grocery store, right? Regular. Then there was government lands, like the state park. Those are the two categories. And I didn't know anything about conservation easements. So a way that you can preserve private lands, had no concept of this. So now working at the foundation, I've learned about conservation easements, and you can put those on cattle ranches. And that's really what we need to focus on. All these cattle ranches out east, they're going to disappear soon. Those lands between Myakka River State Park and Duet, up our waterways, connecting to the Manatee River, the watersheds of our drinking water supply, they're disappearing. Through conservation easements, we can protect these places. We kind of are running out of time.
Yeah, and I always try to look for some sort of an example, a visual example that I could talk to people about and, describe to them why this is important. And those of you that know me know that I spent a lot of time studying the Florida scrub jay. But truth be known, I was really not initially an advocate of the Florida scrub jay. As I said, I grew up hunting. My idea of watching birds was sitting in a turkey blind or flushing quail, or what I really loved was reptiles. I loved indigos and rattlesnakes. At one time, I had over 40 captive reptiles. So when I got into this idea of preserving natural lands, it became evident to me that I'm going to need some sort of a species that I could hold up to say, here's a good reason to do it. The rattlesnakes just weren't going to cut it. It just
people won't buy into that.
Yeah, they just didn't. Yeah. People, right? Although in this crowd it might work because they really are a beautiful, fascinating animal. So I went with the scrub jay, and then when I started looking at the ranch lands, I recognized that the scrub jay probably was not the best ambassador to depict this eastwardly march of the suburbanization of this community into the ranch land. So the idea came to me to use the scrub jay, or excuse me, the towhee. At the time, it was the rufous-sided towhee. Now it's the eastern towhee, because this is a bird that was present from the Charlotte County line to the DeSoto County line to the Manatee County line, and was likely also on the Barrier Islands. So if you can imagine the extent of this bird prior to European settlement, it was pretty much blanketing the entirety of the county. So it has a broad acceptance of various landscapes and habitats, but not too broad. It was just broad enough so that when urban development comes in, the scrub jay is extirpated from that area. So the work that you're doing at the Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast is absolutely critical. The work that Elizabeth is doing to take these ranch lands and keep them in some sort of a preserved status is essential to long-term viability of the natural lands that we've put together. When we were working on the list for the environmentally sensitive lands, Jono and I could point to any property that was on that list and say with a relative degree of certainty that had it not been for those agricultural stewards of generations past, the opportunity to preserve and the fact that those lands were preserved would not have been available to us at all.
And over the course of your career, you've had the opportunity to work on research, on advocacy, on policy, really all the things that we're going to talk about this afternoon. I wondered if there's any experience you can share where all of these things, these three, came together to produce a positive environmental outcome.
Well, I could probably think of several, but hearing the speakers earlier today and the speaker last night, I think I would probably want to do a water-based one. And that would be, and first off, I consider myself fortunate to both be an advocate and an elected official and, and on the policy-making side from various seats. So the one that I would put out or hold out as a great example would be the comprehensive nutrient removal initiative that you've heard talked about here in several talks. And let me just real quick, I actually had to write these down because I would never be able to remember them all. But here, when I talked about the comprehensive nutrient removal, this is what I'm talking about. One cohort of Sarasota County commissioners over about a 10-15 year period passed the following: an irrigation ordinance, an impervious surface development code, a golf course development ordinance, a fertilizer ordinance, a stormwater environmental utility, a septic tank replacement program, package plant upgrades to AWT, the Camp Sawgrass restoration, that's celery fields for those of y'all that don't know Camp Sawgrass, an environmentally sensitive lands program, and a mangrove protection ordinance. And there's one underlying theme about how all of those ordinances and those rules were passed, and that's science. If we did not have the data from Moat Marine Laboratory, IFAS, the monitoring stations that Sarasota County had, there's no way that the Sarasota Board of County Commissioners that I sat on would have been able to maintain 3 or 4 votes to get these activities done, because the opposition was great. I mean, we had trade people coming from the fertilizer from all over the country saying that this is a terrible thing, it's going to destroy their industry. We even had other government agencies telling us, the state tried to preempt us from doing many of these. They were successful with one. The mangrove pruning ordinance was preempted before it went into action into the county. So the commissioners, especially those that did not have confidence in their environmental background, relied completely on the science to make it happen. So if you think about it, all these seagrass and all these water quality improvements that have happened over the last 15, 20 years would not have happened. I can say with assurance they would not have happened if we did not have the foundation of that scientific data to fall back on. But looking forward, we heard Dr. Dr. Hall earlier talk about the need for the continued monitoring and even greater science. So I would suggest to the younger generation that, it's your turn. It's your turn to build on the science. It's your turn to build on the monitoring. And it's your turn to take all of that information to the policymakers and to the government agencies and make a difference.
Well, I'm ready to do it, Jon. Thank you.